This is a special edition here of Beyond the Cage where I'm going to talk a little bit about money fights, GSP's return. Of course, he's going to be taking on Michael Bisping. Michael Bisping's comments about big money fights legacy. Who should title fights be? Conor McGregor's probably going to throw up there, Ronda Rousey, Brock Lesnar, stuff like that. So I'm going to do a quick discussion on that because a lot of this is coming up now because of GSP's return. So first bit of news. If you watched Beyond the Cage most recent episode where I picked the main card for UFC 209, the news had just come out upon releasing said episode that George St. Pierre is in fact returning to the UFC and will be taking on for his first fight Michael Bisping, the current UFC middleweight champion, in a fight for the middleweight championship later this year. It had already been announced earlier this year that Michael Bisping would be taking on Yoel Romero for the middleweight championship after Romero knocked out Chris Weidman following UFC 205. That looked as though to be the next matchup. Now that has completely changed. So I first want to get into GSP coming back first. We'll start with that. GSP coming back is awesome. GSP was a guy that you could say really helped bring the organization into a next level, kind of from the dark ages or the beginning ages of Zuffa, and really helped turn the sport mainstream. He was arguably the sport's first big crossover star, especially in the Canadian market. And now he's obviously been in a couple of movies as well, most recently Kickboxer Vengeance, and of course he debuted in the Captain America Winter Soldier movie as an actual character, not some weird henchman or anything, as Batroc the Leaper, who actually is a real villain in the Marvel comic book universe, which is really cool. Obviously, he wasn't in the movie very long, and what he did was fighting scenes, and he did those very well. So from that aspect, he's good. I haven't seen his role in Kickboxer, so I can't really comment whether he was good or not. And then he's had major apparel deals with Under Armour and Hayabusa. I think he's even had some Gatorade. He had a ESPN This is Sports Center commercial, with the UFC, and has also done that commercial there with the Nas energy drink, with buy it with your money, which is really great. So GSP coming back is a good thing. Despite now being, I think, 35 years old, coming up in November, it would be 5 years since he previously fought that last fight, narrowly defeating Johnny Hendricks to reclaim his welterweight championship. In a lot of people's mind, Johnny Hendricks won that fight. Irregardless, the decision went down. He won that fight. So whenever this fight happens, it's going to be nearly 5 years. Of course, in his retirement, he did have some injury problems. Actually, I believe it was right after he announced his retirement after the Johnny Hendricks fight that he did suffer an injury. So not only is he coming off just simply time off, he's coming off an injury as well. Now, him coming back is a big deal regardless of who he fights and what weight class. That's awesome. Glad he was able to work that out. Of course, one of his teammates, Rory McDonald, I believe now is not training at TriStar. He had been showing up a lot. He had been cornering Bellator events. There was, with a lot of the sponsors, again, that he does already have on the table, I'm sure that was a major sticking point for him in possibly leaving the UFC to go to somewhere like a Bellator or even a Risen or World Series of Fighting, or he could pretty much pick any organization that he wants. And I'm sure organizations would pay it. But even though he retired, which to me should get him out of his contract, I don't know, maybe I guess there was something the UFC was able to retain him, and here he is. I don't know if he's just going to simply fight one or two more times, then retire again, or if he's going to simply fight to get off his contract to then maybe make said more money in another organization. I don't really know, but at least for one more fight, he's going to be in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. According to the UFC website, no thing of how many fights he has left on the deal, what they negotiated, but this is what they did negotiate, is him coming back, number one. Number two, it's going to be up a class. And three, it's going to be for the middleweight championship. That's what they decided. Now, again, GSP coming back is awesome. It is awesome that he is coming back. I'm really looking forward to it. I've always been a fan of George St. Pierre. However, him coming back is awesome. Two, I'm fine with him wanting to move up a weight class. Again, he's now 34, 35 years old. Doesn't probably want to worry about cutting weight. And again, in this new era of drug testing and USADA, maybe just a little easier to just kind of go up the 15 pounds and just fight that way, not having to worry about cutting any weight or very little at all. I'm fine with that. Number 2, he's never fought above 170 pounds. I'm like 99.999% sure that he's never fought above 170 pounds. So for his first fight in a new division that he's never fought in, regardless of any previous championship experience, his first fight should not be for a UFC championship. I think everybody can get on board with that. Regardless of their championship expertise, if you've never fought in the weight class, you probably shouldn't be fighting for that or for the title. Okay, and that's I'm going all time. You know, I don't care about Jose Aldo. I don't care about Conor McGregor. I don't think it should happen. You should have a fight in that weight class first. You know, I don't care whether you're the current champion or what. Now, in Conor McGregor's case, we could always say, oh, he probably was always going to get rid of the featherweight championship, again, which he eventually did. He still held up the division a little bit by not dropping it right away. However, they did create an interim. It's kind of all worked out. But regardless, that shouldn't be the case. Unless, the only exception, there's one exception, that if said champion of whatever division has cleared out the division. You can make a case that at a time Anderson Silva was pretty close to clearing out the division. And I think had John Jones not had this debacle with his personal life, you could make a case that he was starting very closely to cleaning out the light heavyweight division. I think that's safe to say. And I think Jose Aldo, before Conor McGregor, was starting to get close to clearing out the featherweight division. Those are the only exceptions I've seen, and obviously the UFC did allow Anderson Silva to move up, and now Conor McGregor to move up and take other fights when they weren't titled. That to me are the exceptions of the champion not defending their title. But he shouldn't even be fighting for the title. And that's not on Michael Bisping. That's the UFC's organization. And Michael Bisping, I'm pulling up an article dated from March 1st, which in recordance of this video would be yesterday, written by Dave Doyle at Dave Doyle MMA on Twitter at MMA. This is on MMA Fighting. I believe he's taking the quotes from a edition of UFC Tonight. However, it's transcribed here in this article. UFC Tonight again on Fox Sports. Now, in this, Michael Bisping says, I know there are a lot of people who are criticizing me, saying I should fight the #1 contender, somebody like Yoel Romero, and they're absolutely right. But I put the question back on you. If you're Yoel Romero, Luke Rockhold, or even Jacare, any of these guys, if you were offered a fight with GSP, I know for a fact that you're going to take that fight. Why shouldn't I do the same? I deserve this payoff. I deserve this fight, not only for the payday, but I want this fight for my legacy. Now, all of that to me is true. The payoff, it's a big deal, a lot of eyeballs on you, but the legacy thing I don't get, because anybody that really looks at this fight, even if you're a Jacare, Luke Rockhold, or Yoel Romero, again, GSP has never fought above 170 pounds. Now, depending on when this fight takes place, it's going to be nearly 5 years since GSP last competed in the UFC. Okay? So, beating a guy who hasn't fought in 5 years, coming off a serious injury, and has never fought in your weight class, you beating that guy, regardless of how good he was at that other weight class, to me does not a lot for your legacy. If I look back, and let's say that's Michael Bisping's last fight. I doubt it will be. Let's just say it is. Michael Bisping beat Georges St. Pierre, realized, hey, that's the best I'm going to do. That's the most amount of money I'm going to make with the fights that I see I could have. I'm done. I'm retiring as the champion. I've had a good run. I'm now almost 40 years old. I'm good. Okay? If we look back at the legacy of Michael Bisping at that point in time, you look at his last 4 fights. He would defeated Anderson Silva, Luke Rockhold, Dan Henderson, and Georges St. Pierre. Now, let's say he dominates GSP. And let's say he just knocks him out in the first round. Probably not, but let's just say he does, okay? Of those 4, well, I guess the Luke Rockhold one might end up being, I guess if he knocks him out in the first round, you could debate it. But of those 4, would you say beating GSP, with all the factors I meant, does that help his legacy more than the last 3 that he had? I don't know. I think knocking out Luke Rockhold to win the championship on, what was that, less than a month's notice, I think secures his legacy. That fight right there did it. Because the last fight he had, again, Dan Henderson shouldn't have been fighting for the middleweight championship. The UFC allowed Michael Bisping to try to get a rematch, and they also let Dan Henderson trying to go out on top. They realized Dan Henderson wasn't going to fight again. He probably told him, hey, I'm not going to really fight again. I want a big fight. And they said, what the heck? This is the only thing missing from your resume, Dan. We'll give you the fight. Whether it was right or wrong, that's what they did. I see why they did it. I don't like it, but I can accept the fact, and I see their reasons behind it, and it makes it a little easier for me to digest. Maybe that's because I like Dan Henderson. Now this, completely different situation than the Dan Henderson one. Dan Henderson at least had fought in that weight class, had fought for a world championship in that weight class, not only in the UFC, but also was the champion in Pride, or ended being the champion in Pride at that weight class, and again, had beaten the champion. Now, with this case, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, if GSP came back to fight Anderson Silva, a fight that was rumored while both were dominating their respective divisions, that to me might be the fight to make. That, to me, alone would garner not only a big payday for, well, I guess regardless of GSP fights, it would be a big payday, but having a fight Anderson Silva could be a huge card, and they could put that as a pay-per-view main event, as a non-title fight, which you don't see that often anymore. And I think that would be a huge deal. People would tune in to watch that. And both guys, Anderson could go out, and GSP could go out, and that could be a legacy fight, and that's a super fight I think everyone would want. And that's the fight, to me, they should have made, instead of tying up a championship involved in it. Because Yoel Romero or Jacare, however you want to work it out, deserves a shot at the championship. And you can even make a case that Luke Rockhold could deserve a championship, because obviously he does own a victory over Michael Bisping, regardless of losing to him last June. It's a perfect trilogy. The guys have talked a lot of trash, and that's a perfect fight, a trilogy fight. All those fights make sense. The GSP one doesn't, and it all comes back to money. Now, Michael Bisping says legacy. I don't think it does anything for legacy. This is purely money, and I get his motivations, and he's exactly right. If Jacare, Yoel, or Luke Rockhold was offered GSP, you could say they would be fools not to take it because of the money. And he's absolutely right. Who wouldn't take that fight? I'm not putting the onus on Michael Bisping, because again, if I'm Michael Bisping and they're like, here's the guys you're going to face. We'll give you 3 options. We'll give you Yoel Romero, Jacare Souza, or George St. Pierre. If they're just letting you pick those guys, I don't know what they actually sat down with him, how they did it, but I'm just using a hypothetical scenario. They said, these are the 3 guys you can fight for your next fight, Michael. Okay? And, you know, assuming all the percentage is the same, obviously, who do you think is going to sell more pay-per-views as your opponent? What fight's going to be built up more? You against George St. Pierre, you against Yoel Romero, or you against Jacare Souza? The answer is George St. Pierre. So from Michael Bisping's standpoint, I can't blame him for wanting to take a fight. If he never takes a big money fight again in his career, that's fine. He got this opportunity, and he's taking it. I cannot blame Michael Bisping. And I can't even really blame George St. Pierre, because again, he probably said, I want to fight at middleweight. I don't know if he specifically called out Michael Bisping. I'm sure he had a few opponents in mind. And the UFC, again, they're the promoters. They're the one that makes these matchups. So they're the one that have decided Michael Bisping's against GSP, and both parties agreed to it. Because it already looked like Romero was on the table for Michael Bisping. So what this boils down to is the UFC. If anyone should be criticized, it should be the UFC with their matchmaking and with Dana White leading the organization. If you're going to be mad about this matchup, that's who you have to be mad at, because they're the ones that presented it. They presented those opportunities. Now, sure, Michael Bisping can sit here and say, oh, he wants GSP all he wants, but at the end of the day, the UFC is the ones that makes the matches. The fighters don't make the matches, regardless of how much they want to fight guy X, Y, or Z, or how much that woman wants to fight woman X, Y, or Z. Whatever the case may be, that's not how it works. And it all goes back again. I brought up Conor McGregor earlier because these big money fights that Conor McGregor has been drawing. And Conor McGregor is getting paid very well because he's bringing in viewers. And are these other guys necessarily doing that? I don't know. Will these other guys do it? You know, Tyron Woodley's talk about big money fights against Conor or Nick Diaz and I think Rose Namajunas even mentioned something about a big money fight. And I get it. I get wanting to cash in because the average pay for a UFC fighter is not great. It's probably better than a regular job, than most jobs, or at least has that big potential. There's definitely a career there that you can earn more. Sure, everyone starts at the bottom usually in almost any field that they're in, and they can work their way up. So there is room to make money in this organization, absolutely. But in this game, because it's not a team game, you only can look out for yourself. And I understand wanting to make the most money you can, as quickly as you can, and get out, not having to drag on your career and take unnecessarily beating or bodily damage that affects you later on in life. I get it. I do. Everybody would want to do that. Everybody would like to make a certain amount of money by a certain amount of age and coast the rest around life. Now, sure, you may do something to keep you busy. You got to do something to keep you busy. But in terms of monetary, I would say a lot of people would agree with that method. So I'm not hating on anyone that wants a lot of money. That's just how we've developed our society. But at a certain point, you can't just do fights because of the money, whether you're more so for an organization than a fighter. The reason I say this is because not everybody that gets to the top is going to be a huge star. It's just a fact. Same thing in team sports. Not every team that makes it to the championship, people are going to like either their players, their style of play, what their city is, their colors, whatever the case, the reason may be, regardless of how good you are at your sport, whether it's part of a team or as an individual, just some people are not going to like you. It's just a fact. Some people are going to talk a lot more. That's going to garner a certain level of interest. Some people are going to talk about a lot less. And then maybe they'll garner less interest. I don't know. But some people just aren't going to end up being huge names. Some people aren't going to be huge personalities. And some people are going to let their work in the octagon or whatever sport they play do their talking for them. And not everything should be dictated by money. Because if we're only looking at fights that can draw a lot of money, there's a consequence to said be that. Because if some of those quote-unquote big money fights don't deliver, that's going to draw a lot less interest in said money fights further on. If everything's a big money fight, eventually you're going to oversaturate. You got to have some fights that aren't big money fights, that aren't the big draw. That's what makes those big money fights, because they don't happen as often. If every fight is a big money fight, it loses its specialness, right? By definition, if every fight's the next best, the next greatest fight in the UFC, then eventually fans are, wait a minute, this is now the greatest fight in the UFC? And sure, there's always going to be a hardcore fan like myself or anybody else that are going to watch every single fight or is going to watch every single football game. There's always going to be that core group that's going to watch everything. What the big money fights are for are to draw people in that don't normally watch your sport. But again, if you're building up every single one as the next big one, you're going to dilute and start to discriminate against that casual fan base, the ones that you're really trying to get the money from. That's what creates the big money draw and interest. So from the UFC's own standpoint, they have to kind of spread these out to maybe 2-3 times a year, not every time a year. And only doing it for the money can eventually bite the organization. Again, this is now an organization that's cutting costs because their new ownership group just spent $4 billion. So not only are they trying to cut costs and then make costs, so they're trying to recoup that $4 billion, but the thing is, you're not going to recoup $4 billion in one day. You're probably not going to do it in, well, maybe you could do it in a year, I guess depending on the industry. But it's not something that you're just going to go, boom, well, we got our investment back, guys. So that's how I'm looking at it. And eventually you're going to have guys in certain divisions that don't draw as big an interest as a George St. Pierre, like a Yoel Romero, like a Jacare Souza. All right, pick a division and pick a name. that aren't going to just garner as much interest. But that is to not say that guys that don't garner a lot of interest now can't garner interest later. If Jacare Souza or Yoel Romero went into a matchup with Michael Bisping, knocked or submitted Michael Bisping out in the first round, that garners a lot of interest. Look at Holly Holm, for example. Was there that much interest in Holly Holm as a title contender? She was currently at that time ranked about 9 or 10 against the #1 fighter in the world, arguably the greatest pound-for-pound fighter in the world at that time in Ronda Rousey. And her 2 efforts in the UFC weren't that great. She barely beat Raquel Pennington, and I think had one other fight. I'm forgetting the name of her second. It wasn't Jermaine Durant. She just fought Durant at me. But I think it was Marion Rabeau, if I said that correctly. I think so. Barely beat her, then gets a title shot. All of a sudden, what happens? She knocks out Ronda Rousey. She does the unthinkable and kind of becomes a star. Now there's interest in Holly Holm's fight. There was big interest for her fight against Miesha Tate. They put her in back-to-back Fox main events in Valentina Shevchenko. 2 back-to-back main events. The Fox main event there against Valentina Shevchenko. Then they put her in the main event of another pay-per-view against Duran Duran for another championship. That's how one fighter that wasn't that high up in terms of intrigue or name recognition went to a star. Now all of a sudden she's falling because she's now lost 3 in a row. But you get what I'm saying. Stars can be created just like that. Just because someone is not a star now doesn't mean they can't be a star later. So thinking that Jacare Souza or Yoel Romero cannot be big names for the UFC just because they aren't right now is a false factor. Jacare wins the championship. That's huge. He's, I would consider, a pretty well-known commodity in Brazil, and he's a world jiu-jitsu champion. The guy's a beast. Obviously, for English-speaking fans, whether you're from America or from another country, maybe you don't understand him as well because he speaks Portuguese. Maybe that's a little bit of a turnoff. But Anderson Silva never spoke very much English. Now has learned English a lot better than when he first came into the UFC. But when he first started, why were people fans? Because what he did in the ring. That's how he became a star. He didn't become a star because he was talking a whole bunch of trash. Everyone can become a star in different ways. So that's what the UFC is missing. They're missing out on those fighters potentially becoming stars just because they aren't now and they don't think they can make money. Anybody can make money for this organization if what they do in the octagon is pleasing. That to me is the #1 factor. Everything else to me is secondary. If Conor McGregor talked a whole bunch of trash but was a 500 fighter, it doesn't hold as much weight. There's not enough intrigue. But the fact that he's talking trash and winning fights, that's what is making him a star. It's those 2 in concert. If one of those others is off, it's going to be a little harder to be a star. Not impossible, just harder. And I think that's what the UFC here is missing a little bit in their structure. Because tentpole events are great, and I think Bellator is doing a good job of this, calling them tentpole events. They're having some, they recognize that every card's going to be stacked. They're going to have 4 to 5 stacked tentpole events and some stronger other events throughout the year. And I think Bellator is building up a solid brand now. Obviously, Bellator hasn't tried the pay-per-view model out, or I guess they did once. Didn't really work out for them. They've pretty much abandoned that. And they're doing well right now. Obviously, they have a nice backing. They have a nice organization. Scott Coker seems to be running well. To say they won't go into a pay-per-view again, I don't know. We'll see. I don't think he tried it in Strikeforce. I don't think he did, from what I recall. I don't remember him trying it in Strikeforce. That's not to say he couldn't try it or won't try it here with Bellator. We shall see. But for the UFC's model, they could do that. If they still want to reduce the number of pay-per-views, they can make all the pay-per-views the big money fights and still have some more spread out. That way it's not seeming like every fight's the next big one, and they're not producing cards, which, again, I'm not hating on Holly Holm, but UFC 208 was not a great pay-per-view card as far as the structure. It had some decent fights on it, but it wasn't that great of a card. It didn't do well, conversely, and those are the pay-per-views we need to avoid. And that's not to say it's because women were the main event. Obviously, Ronda Rousey has surpassed 1 million pay-per-view buys several times. So I'm not hating on the fact that a women's fight was in the main event, but UFC 206 wasn't well received too, and that was a men's fight as the main event. It has no bearing on the issue. And the issue is building up those big money fights that the UFC can, and building up those pay-per-views. If they're 4 or 5 times a year, I think that's going to help the UFC not only spread out the money fights so it's not oversaturated, and still do them to where fighters can make a big payday, but they're not going to do it at the behest of the rest of the division. At least I hope. We shall see. This fight contradicts a lot of that. We'll see if it works out. I'm hoping for a great fight. I'm gonna cover the fight regardless, and we'll see what happens. Maybe we will get Yoel and Jacare too. Obviously, that was a very close fight, and if that's what we got to get to have them fight for the title, so be it. It sucks for those two gentlemen, but that's how the UFC is playing it right now. I don't particularly agree with it, but that's what they're doing. Once again, I am Jim Graham. Thank you for checking out this special edition here of Beyond the Cage. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Graham, and you can check out Beyond the Cage on Facebook as well, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. Thanks for checking out this special edition, and I'm also going to provide a link right here, my most recent episode of Beyond the Cage, where I pick the main card fights for UFC 209, and I also preview Bellator 174. So once again, I am Jim Graham, and thank you for listening to this special edition of Beyond the Cage.